And before we get into that, I'll give an introduction to our first speaker. His name is Stefano Negri, and he'll be giving a talk about exposing GraphQL as managed APIs. So a little bit about Stefano. He's a solution architect working for WSO2, and spent a lot of his professional career making applications and systems communicate with each other through different patterns and technologies like messaging systems, ESB, SOA, and API management or protocols like SOAP and REST. When he's not spending time with his families, he loves hiking, skiing, and cooking. So now, without any further delay, I'm really excited to bring you Stefano. And
okay, thank you, Daniel. So I understood we can start, or should we wait till someone joining? Or I think we can.
You can start.
Okay, we can start. So thank you for the wholesome introduction. Now I can share my screen, and hopefully you can see my screen now. So you already introduced the subject. So I will speak today quickly what's the benefit of having your GraphQL services or GraphQL API managed by an API manager. So this is my target. And also here, so you introduced me very well. Thank you again. Here you can find some references of me, so some contacts if you want. Would be happy to be in touch with all of you. There's my email address and my LinkedIn reference. Let me spend just a couple of words on my company. Even if I will try to keep this speech as more agnostic as possible, nevertheless, I will briefly touch the product that I'm dealing with. So it's a WSO2 API manager. So I belong to WSO2. I joined the company a couple of years ago. I'm a solution architect. So the company is a mixed American, UK-based, Sri Lankan software company. In this, we are API code integration and identity and access manager. We are in the API manager. We are well considered by the analysts, as you can see, and this is the latest Forrester report. And important to notice that we are open source. So at the end of the presentation, I will give you the link how to download the product, how to download the API manager, so you can play around it a bit if you like the presentation. So what I want to discuss, as I said, why you may need to have an API manager for your GraphQL API. So you are all, I suppose, very expert of GraphQL. You are either GraphQL service providers, or you are a developer of application that make use of GraphQL. Why you need a third component, a man in the middle? What the reason that this API manager can bring some benefits? Basically, the answer to this question is independent of the GraphQL. So the answer is, the question is the same, whether you are REST API or GraphQL API. So basically, you may need an API manager when, for example, you want to expose your business internal capabilities to external partners. So you have your services, you have your GraphQL services, you want to make them available to external community. It can be a partner, it can be a customer who wants to create an application based on your services. That's you may also need to make them available internally. Reorganize how you make you distribute your services internally. So this is something that you usually do, but with API manager you can do it in a more organized way. On top of this, you can govern your business. You can make some government. For example, life cycle of your services. You can make your service available as a prototype. Then you can deploy. You can retire. You can block. You can manage. You can introduce different versions of your services. You can control the life cycle. This is another potential benefit that you can have using API manager. But definitely one of the most reasons that people are looking in an API manager is to handle security. So you have your GraphQL services, you are expert developing that, you don't want to take care directly of all the matter related to security, to authentication, authorization. And for that, maybe you need a component dedicated to that. So an API manager can secure your business assets in terms of authentication, authorization, or for example, typically has capability to intercept malicious code or malicious query. Another potential driver is to control the access to business, to your business, the access to your business assets. It's all related to quota management, subscription layer, quota management to limit the hits to your API invocation to a certain number, or to make them available via different layers of subscription. And this is the base that you can start monetize your asset on. And finally, you may want to have a component that give you some insight on what's happening on your services, not only from technical point of view, but from business point of view. Who is using them? How often they use? How many subscribers you have daily or monthly? How many API your team is releasing every month, for example. These are the main driver, in my opinion, that leads a corporate to have to onboard an API manager and to put this layer on top of your backend services. In order to do that, typically an API manager, as you can imagine, has different components. I should cover all these requirements with different components. The more intuitive is a gateway. Typically, people sometimes mix up API management and gateway. It's not one-to-one. It's not that. An API manager component is something more. Of course, a gateway is the data plane, which is put in the middle between the consumer, your application consumer, your application, and your services. Your backend service can be GraphQL, can be REST, can be whatever. And is where the policies that you define for security, for quota, for intercept malicious code, or for throttling, etc., apply. And this, but it's not enough. So an API manager typically different components. For example, you might have another very common component that is always present in every API manager tool is the developer portal. It's a sort of repository, registry of all API. And also, sometimes those are bundled together, but there must be a component, an administration tool where you, an API developer, applies the policies, some security policies, throttling policies, etc. And then there may be, separated or not, some control plane components, some key manager for managing the authentication, or traffic manager for controlling the traffic, or the component related to business analysis and real-time analysis, etc. Typically, an API manager is structured like this, different components. There must be some differences. The markets and different tools have different architecture, etc. But nevertheless, a classical API manager tool has to have, of course, a gateway. Is a basic component. As a gateway is the proxy where your API invocation are passing through before joining the backend, and where the policies are running. It has to support authentication, authorization of the APIs, functionality for authenticate, authorize the access to your API. And here, typically, now the standard is a host 2. This is standard, so every API manager should at least support host 2. Typically, they support other basic authentication, other authentication methods like basic authentication of API keys, but those are the standard nowadays. And then it has to support, for example, typically mutual authentication of some other protocol, but it has to have a component dedicated to authentication authorization. Another important feature is throttling. It has to have some way the capacity to block an API invocation if this exceed a quota, for example, or provide some kind of subscription plans. So provide the usage of your API via different subscription plans for eventually monetization. And here, for example, some components are directly integrated. Some API manager are directly integrated with billing engine for monetization. That can be also a good features. It has to support versioning and API lifecycle, the capacity to provide the documentation, and of course, an important component is the development portal. And finally, all these features must be handled in a friendly, using typically a friendly user interface. So you must have, for example, we have a publisher which is used to define the API or import the API definition and apply authentication policy, token policies, etc. So far we have discussed in general API manager and backend services. We didn't discuss of GraphQL. This because managing GraphQL services does not necessarily change this list of drivers that I show you. So they apply to REST SOAP of GraphQL services or API independently. So it's really valid for independently of which kind of backend services you have. But it's important also to mention that GraphQL APIs have a specific peculiarities that an API manager product must take in account. So it's not enough that to have a generic API manager tool, but it should be better to have an API manager tool that has a dedicated features for GraphQL if you have GraphQL services to manage. Why this? Okay, I don't want to talk about the differences between REST and GraphQL to you. You're basically the expert compared to me. But of course, you can easily understand that a matter is make some authentication authorization for REST API, and it's a completely different matter when it comes to GraphQL services. For example, for authentication, you can request to authenticate at API level or a resource level, but this does not make any sense when you have a GraphQL API as a backend. So in that case, you may want to define granular authentication authorization policies at operational levels, because in a single API invocation, you can include many operations. Some of them can be open, some of them can be limited. Can be accessed only to authenticated users. So in that case, you may want to do something like that. And so import an API definition and say for the mutation, for example, you want to enable security. For query, you can enable security for some of the queries, but for some other, you can say, okay, this is open. For this, I don't need any security enabled. Anyone can run the all products operation. Anyone can run a query can submit a query with the all products operations. And the same for authorization. So you may need, for example, to restrict the access to a mutation of a query to a group, for example, to make some sort of role-based access control. There are different approaches. So in our case, our approach is based on the scopes, using scopes. But in any case, there must be a way to say, okay, this mutation operation are allowed only to user that belongs to a retailer group, while for other query, I don't need any kind of role-based access control, or for other, I need that they belongs to another group. So this is a feature that a facility that an API manager should provide for this kind of activities. And the third peculiarity is related to rate limiting. Okay, of course, as you can imagine, it does not make any sense to limit the access of a GraphQL API based on the number of hits per second or per minute, because with a single invocation you can run a query that retrieve few data on a single asset, or I don't know, some hundred of records coming from different assets. So there must be a more granular control of your of the access to your operation. You can want to allowing some sort of operational level rate limits. For example, like this. For example, you can say that is for this activity, this mutation remove product, you can enable 10,000 transactions per minute or 10,000 invocation per minute. For other, you can put unlimited because it's not really expensive in terms of effort for your backend services. And another component very important is that API Manager tool should or usually have or should have is a sort of query complexity analyzer, something like that. So this can be used for two main purposes. So to protect your APIs and to monetize your APIs. So as you can imagine, you can in a single query you can run very complex. In a single API call, you can run very complex query, and this can lead to misuse of your instrument. So this is can open the door to malicious users that can try to, for example, block your servers with make some denial of services, and via very complex query. Or, for example, if you want to monetize your APIs, you can't monetize. It does not make much sense to monetize your API based on the number of hits. But because with an API invocation, you can retrieve, as I said before, very few data or very complex, make very complex query. So for that, this component is typically based on the query depth limitation or query complex limitation, can calculate the complexity of the query and block, for example, if you want to protect your API, block your request if this, I don't know, the depth is greater than 7, 10, or the complexity is more than 500, etc. At the same time, you can provide a subscription layer based on which limit, for example, you can provide a subscription layer free, but with a query that cannot be deeper than 2, 3 layers, etc. Finally, we have discussed briefly what I want to talk to you about what we mean for first-class GraphQL support. So an API manager tool can provide, can use typically any API manager tool for running your GraphQL. But it's better to have what we call first-class GraphQL support. For example, if you are an API developer, you would be able to use a tool, for example, a publisher, which create a GraphQL starting from an SDL schema. No? So you don't have to edit the operation, etc., one by one. But starting from a schema, you can import the schema and have your API directly created in an API manager automatically. Or, for example, for app developer, you may need some app developer connect typically with the developer portal, and you may need facilities like the listing of the GraphQL APIs, for example, or the searching option. You can make some search based on the name of the API, on the version of the API, of the developer of the API, or for example, a tag-based search, etc. You may need a dedicated tryout tool. So it's important when you are an app developer, before starting developing your API, maybe try to run the API and see what is the format of the answer, etc. So to have this facility in the development portal is definitely quite important, and is definitely different whether you have a REST API or GraphQL API. So a dedicated tryout tool for GraphQL API is also a feature that is very, very, very important. And then you may have still in the development portal features like categorization, the possibility to access to a documentation of the API, so the API developer can create the documentation, and the app developer can see the documentation of the API to make a proper create properly the app. And for both features like download the option to download the SDL schema, either in the publisher or in the development portal. This is what we consider first-class GraphQL support, and what a typical API manager tool should provide. Okay, before moving to a very quick demo, I have still probably 10 minutes. Here, when the slide will circulate, you can find how you can get practice with our product. So you can download, as I said, this app open source. You can download our API manager directly from our site or from the GitHub repository. We have also some Slack channel, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and feel free to do it and to practice a bit on our API manager tool. And yeah, so before going to the question, we show you quickly the product, or in this case, our WSO2 API manager. And as you can imagine, the first component that you come across is the publisher. So the publisher is the component that will be used by an API developer to onboard your API on the API manager and to apply policy. So in the publisher, you have a list of already available API. You can see the status. For example, this is a publisher, and this is a GraphQL API. Then you can create a new GraphQL API starting, as I said before, from an SDL schema. Yeah, at the moment we have just one option to load the file. Use possibly direct a URL, but in this case, I have to provide the schema definition. I have now this famous Star Wars API schema definition. Then you have to go. For the endpoint. I can create the API. As you can see, directly there's overview, some standard information, the context, the version, etc. As I said before, you can create different versions of this API, the same API. And here you can see automatically it loaded the operation in the SDL schema. This is what we call first-class support. And then you can start, once this is done, you can start, here the operations, you can start apply the policies. For example, you may say, okay, I want to make this API available HTTP or HTTPS, or mutual SSL. I want to enable or disable mutual SSL, provide a certificate. Or, as I said before, you have to specify which application level security you want to implement. So, for example, basic authentication or API key or auth2. Nowadays, the standard for the API is API manager auth2, which, by the way, will be part of the next talk. But you can also say, okay, no, in this case, I want to enable basic authentication. And then you can, for example, another important features that you API manager provides the possibility to mediate the service. So between the application and the backend, you can, for example, filter the message, transport the data, or make some kind of orchestration. This is what we call mediations. And also caching. Also caching is quite important. You can enable caching in the gateway if you may. And then this, you can work operation per operation, and either or at API level or operation level, decide whether you want to enable security, and you enable the security you define in the runtime configuration. If you want to introduce some kind of role-based asset control, or some kind of rate limiting per single operation. So I can say 10, this only 10 transactions per minute, not more. And yeah, you have to provide the endpoint. I don't remember which is the endpoint. It should be this one. And this is the business plan that you can make this available to the subscriber. This discussion I did before, and this is important also the life cycle. So this is the governance of the your API. So the moment when you create API, this is in a status created, so no one can use it. Then you can say, okay, I can prototype, or I can publish, and once published, I can demote to create, or I can deprecate, etc., etc. In the case I publish, and when it's published, this now, since now on, this is available in the developer portal. Okay, as those two API are public, as you can see in the overview, these API are not public, so anyone can see. But this I can change it, also I can limit the visibility that we have to specific groups or specific roles. But as these are public, anyone can see, also without signing in. Okay, so I can see my API, and I can test it. Okay. Like this, I can rely on the tryout tool and say, okay, and can see all the things, the ID, title, and run. However, this will fail. It will fail because I said, okay, I enable security. So even the tryout, even in the tryout tool, this is limited by security. So as I enable host 2, I have to provide an access token. So I have to go here. I have to log in as I'm another person. I'm an API developer. And say, okay, I have created an application. This application has an access token, a consumer key, a consumer secret as an access token. And I can say, okay, I want to subscribe to this API. Okay, and subscribe. And then I say, okay, probably this I can generate the access token here, or I can distribute the consumer key, consumer secret to my application developer, and they can create with a command line or with the HTTP call, they can create themselves an access token. But I can also create from here. I can generate the access token. And with this access token, I can go back to my API, try out, put the access token here. And now, if I want to select all field, ID, title, run it, and now I can see the outcome of my play. I didn't apply any specific policy at the moment. I didn't apply any restriction in terms of throttling, in terms of authorization. Otherwise, I would need to create an access token with a specific scope, or I would be limited in the number of the API. And then, yeah, you can distribute as an app developer. You can distribute the consumer key, consumer secret of this application that is enabled to run this API. You can see the subscription. Subscription. So this application is authorized to run this API. So a user can create a token and run this API in a secure, controlled way. And I have still a couple of minutes. Then you can go to, for example, a dashboard. This is the analytics part. You can see details of your business inside. So not only the usage, the detail of, for example, the performance of your API, okay, here is not meaningful because it's just one attempt. But not only the performance of your API, but you can also business overview. So how many subscription you have per API, or yeah, how many hits have been, how many API has been invoked, how many faults you had, or throttle if you have someone throttled, how many subscription you have for your API, and who subscribe to your API. You can have under control your API, the API you created, because you enter the same users that create the API. Okay, I don't want to go further. Eventually, if you, as I said, if you are interested, I will circulate the links. So I'm open for question if you have.
Thank you so much for the talk, Stefano. That was really interesting. We had some questions come in, and the first is, and I'm also curious about this, is this API manager, is it open source? And is it one of those things that you can self-host or have a hosted version by WSO2?
I'm afraid I didn't understand correctly. There was some breaking lines. So, but in any case, the product is open source, meaning that you can download it. You can download from the GitHub public repository, and then it's for that one it's completely free. You can do whatever you want. You can also go build a productive API manager and go to production and use it. The other version, the version that comes from our site, is also open. You can download it, you can use it, but when it comes to going live, then you have to activate a subscription. So there are two versions are identical. The second one is updated more frequently. So the one from our side is updated more frequently. The other, it's update every 2-3 months. But you can download the source. You can modify the code, do whatever you want, and also run it in production.
I understand. We have also another one. Does the API manager work the same as APIG?
Well, yes. As I said, I try to be the most agnostic as possible. What I listed is a list of features of APIs, and then I drag a bit on the capabilities for GraphQL. Functional wise, they are similar. Yes.
I see. And then one last question. Will it pass the authenticated user to the GraphQL server? So, I mean, essentially, the API manager allows you to introduce an authentication layer, which begs the question, does that mean that if your GraphQL API already has an authentication, how does that work with these two layers of authentication?
There is a distinction of responsibility. API manager is responsible to authenticate, but the GraphQL server may need for his calculation, may be aware who is the user. This is possible. This is possible to send to the server in a format of JWT the details of the users. All the details they are present in the user store. Right? So user, not password, but groups, belongs, email, telephone number, whatever. Yes, this is possible.
I see. Okay, so if there are no more questions, oh yeah, how about GraphQL subscription? Is that compatible?
It is ongoing. So at the moment we support the mutations and queries, and we are releasing the next version for subscriptions.
Okay,
The next version will be subscription as well.
Over WebSockets, I assume, right?
Yes.
Cool. Well, Stefano, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
It was really insightful. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks.
Yeah, sure. We'll be here. Any other question? Bye.